My name is Linda, and somewhere between April 12th and April 14th, I lost my daughter to what's been identified as a fatal overdose of fentanyl. My daughter left behind a family that greatly loved her, children that loved her, and at some point she walked away from a business that was thriving and doing well. One of the things that I've seen happen in people that are recovering and just in general recovering from anything, it's not just the people, but it's the people around them, is that we tend to put like a label on them. We deem them to be this way or that way, and we can't see them any other way. I had a guy in my group one time, and he was an alcoholic. And one night, him and his wife, that also was an alcoholic, were driving down the road and they got into a car wreck. He survived the car wreck, and his wife did not. They had several children that they left behind, and the children went into foster care. And he served a considerable amount of time in prison for the murder of his wife. When he sat in group, he had this tendency to tell me who he was, all the things he couldn't do, and all the things he could do. And I reminded him that, did you think that all these bad things were going to happen? Did you predict all these bad things in your life? And he said, no. I said, did you predict that you were going to have a daughter that beautiful and that successful? No, I didn't. And I said, so how can you put a label on yourself or put a roof on yourself? And I call it a roof because he was a roofer. Put a roof on yourself and call it done. We tend to look at people in a stage of some kind of transformation that they're in. Um, we look at we look at somebody like that hasn't drank for years and years. He's depressed. He's riddled with guilt and shame and going through lots of different things in his own head and suffering through his own kind of loss, because his wife was his high school sweetheart. They were married a long time, and from what he said, they had a beautiful marriage. So he is left with that face and that image and that pain that's embedded deep in him every single day of his life. And if you meet this man in this terrible state that he's in, whether it's sitting in prison or being out of prison, it's quick and it's easy to make this determination. Watching him in my group, he was quiet. He didn't want to talk. He kind of had a chip on his shoulder, and he was a little grumpy. When you pushed him enough, he would throw something negative at you, a negative statement. He didn't interact with the rest of the group members, and he didn't play well with other people. So if I was to make a judgment based on what he was at that moment, I would say I would say that he's an angry man that had no guilt at all about his wife's death, didn't care, and probably somebody that's going to go out and drink again, and that he is selfish, and his kids are completely doomed to have a man like him in their life. If I was going to look at him in that stage, there would be a lot of things that I could say about who he was in that position. But that's not where he stayed. Because truth is, we are all in this transition phase of our life. We're constantly changing and, for the most part, I hope improving. This man sat in my group for a while. He went from that, and then he went into this grief mode where he had a lot of anger at himself. He had a lot of anger at her. He had a lot of anger at the whole system. He had a lot of different feelings about different things. And guess what? He worked through it. And when he worked through it, this gentle person started coming out. This leader in the group that started taking other people under his wing that were struggling, teaching them the things in the group that we were all learning, supporting them, encouraging them. He got book for each one of his children, and he had several, and every day he wrote a page in that book to his children, and he dedicated it. He began to build a relationship with the foster mother versus throwing so much hate at her, and he began to foster and rebuild new relationships around him. And when he and as he got closer to the end, he started having all these ideas about what he wanted to do in his life and what life was going to look like after his wife. If we saw him in this stage, we would think of it as he's got promise, he's got hope, and he's going somewhere in his life, and he certainly is remorseful, he's learning, and he's growing. Now let's go fast forward. Let's suppose that later on he has his kids back, he has his house, and he's working and he's juggling daycare, getting up with the kids, finding shoes in the morning, washing their hair, making dinner, and he's struggling as this single father, trying to keep up with every chore in the house and all the kids in the house and the fighting. And if you catch him in this light, he's going to be short with his kids. He's going to raise his voice to his kids. He might become antisocial because his workload at home is so big that he can barely keep up with it. And when you look at him, he's probably not going to be showered real well all the time. He might have some of his dirty work clothes on. And if you go to his house, you might find dishes in his sink. You might find toys on the floor. And if you judge him in this state, you could judge him as this sloppy, uncaring, undevoted, I guess, selfish father. Maybe even some people might say that he's abusive because he raises his voice to his kids, and he raises his voice out of frustration. The point of it is that we could follow this man throughout his whole life, and at different periods of his life, we could put him under a microscope and we could judge him right where he is and the different phase and the different part of transition that he's going through in his life. And some of us would see him in a very positive light, and some of us would see him in a very negative life. But the great thing is, like I told him all the time, don't build a roof. Don't finalize anything, and never ever check a box on a person and think that you know everything they are at that period of their life, because they're only transitioning. They're moving on to bigger and they're moving on to better things of life, and they're learning how to grow and they're learning how to be better. Ultimately, life is one big school, and we are constantly learning and growing and becoming better and better people. At least that's what I like to believe. And we have to be super careful not to look at a person where they are in their stage, and remember there's a much bigger picture and there's a much bigger direction they're going in their life. And that's why I love working in recovery, because people can come in one phase of their life or one transition of their life, and it looks very bleak, it looks very bad, and sometimes the people are not in their best favored position. And after being in treatment and having some time under their belt of sobriety and some brain healing, this other person emerges. And sometimes it surprises them, and sometimes it surprises me. But the bigger thing I've learned in my life is that my mind, I have to keep it open, and I have to realize that what I see in that person is not the much bigger picture. It may not be where they're going. It may not be the final part of who they are, because they still are growing, no matter the age they are and no matter who they are.